This has to be a new record for the most spikiest of spiky, spiked riddled Batman figures to have ever spiked. And it stands to show that no matter how many spikes you put on a Batman figure, you're still going to be able to deduce exactly what kind of buck or what kind of tooling that McFarlane's going to be utilizing for a specific iteration of Batman, in which this case is going to be the incarnation from Batman Troika, of which I've only seen a couple of little panels here and there that shows them very exaggerated as far as proportions, dynamic illustrations, and then most definitely the all-black suit with, again, an awful lot of elongated spikes, particularly the ears on his cowl, super stylized and elongated, protruding, and at that point it's going to become incredibly subjective as to whether or not you vibe with that style and with that look of Batman. This time it's brought to us in 3D fashion to an extent for the DC Multiverse figure, and the reason for why I say that is because despite having those characteristics that call it back to the Batman Troika storyline that takes place after Nightfall, of basically just kind of providing a bit of a resolution of what happened in the events of Nightfall and Batman trying to kind of get back to a sense of norm. But at the same time, I gotta be honest, they've even kind of accounted that this was taking place around the time that Batman Returns was a big deal. The Tim Burton Batman movies were kind of all the hype, so they kind of stylized the suit to kind of mimic that. And you can see that not only from that design in the comics, but also here in McFarlane Toys fashion. They pretty much decked him out in a completely all-black suit with quite literally not a single shade or color change whatsoever as far as the palette is concerned. It's completely all the same jet black from top to bottom as far as the core paint app utilized for the costume. There's no change in the cape, there's no change in the thighs and the boots and anything. I was thinking to myself that maybe they were gonna go for like a lighter black for the main torso and sleeves and a little bit around the thighs and maybe a darker shade to kind of contrast the boots and the gauntlets to the rest of the suit, but no, it's quite literally an entire black, to the point where it almost kind of reminds me of the Justice League America Plastic Man Build-A-Figure version of that Batman that came in there. And it's funny that I bring that up, since to an extent, you'll also be able to note the other little thing about this Batman figure that I was kind of calling back as far as the amount of spikes to try to disguise it and pass it off as the Troika, because when it all kind of boils down to it, the giveaways as to why it is that this guy may or may not look a little too familiar would have to be the only semblance of color on this figure, which would have to be the yellow utility belt and the symbol embedded there on the front, which is a very iconic symbol. Of course, you have the very traditional bat symbol on the chest, but that's gonna then bring your attention to the fact that this is in fact a buck. It's funny because I was very, very quick to kind of call it back to the Three Jokers buck, except it's not. Don't worry, I know that it's not, because the Justice League of America version that was all black, that was part of that Plastic Man Build-A-Figure, was in fact the Three Jokers, just all black. Here, the first figure that came to mind is quite honestly the Batman Spawn buck, in which they're kind of Frankensteining things together that at first I thought was kind of neat. And the reason for why I know that is because I did manage to cover that blue and gray variant, that Platinum Chase variant that was being found in certain Targets that came with a gray suit and the blue aesthetic, as opposed to the black and gray that came packaged with the Spawn in that 2-pack. Here, it looks like they're kind of taking that same approach with the buck, because you'll notice that you're utilizing what appears to be the Three Jokers chest plate, the sculpting of the thighs, specifically the arms. I could recognize the little indentation inside of the shoulder pieces, all too familiar, to the point where instinctively I can tell that that is in fact the Hush limbs. Specifically, like I said, with the way that the suit is sort of creasing inside of the shoulder piece right here, the way that the biceps are molded, and then most definitely when you come across the curled up hand accessories, or at least the specific default hands that he comes with by default here. You'll notice that that's very much indicative to that of the Hush buck. But when we start to get a little differential with things that make this figure just a little bit more appealing, is of course something that I've already called upon, which would have to be the application of the elongated spikes on not only the gauntlets, but even the very stylized boots with the very over-busy, overcomplicated spikes protruding from the side of the boots right here. That is mainly a callback to the Troika design. But then you get to the top part here where there's so much brand new that that's mainly the attractive features that made me want to pick this guy up. Would have to be basically everything that's happening around basically the base of the neck and up. Specifically the little collar piece that is holding down a wired cloth cape, which is once again nylon. But I don't know what it is. Maybe it's the way the science behind the tailoring is, or maybe it's the much more rigid and very durable wiring is stitched into the cape. I don't know what it is. I can't explain it, but there's something specifically designed about this cape that, despite not being the biggest fan of the nylon, there's something about the way that this wire, and again, the stitching and the tailoring with the sizing of the little rims here towards the end trimming, that make it very stylized just enough to where every time that I pose this cape in any kind of animation or style or direction, it looks pretty badass. It legitimately looks like it's blowing in the wind the way that a natural Batman-esque cape would flow. So if you notice that right here, just off the cuff, very randomized. I'm just going to pose it like so. And look at that. It legitimately looks badass. It looks intimidating. It looks incredibly emblematic of the Dark Knight himself. And regardless of whatever pose that I can barely manage to put this guy in, a little bit of foreshadowing there, the cape legitimately adapts to the overall presence of the figure that, again, I'm not the biggest nylon fan, but at the same time, there's something about the way that they were able to tailor this specific cape that it's doing wonders for me, and I would go as far as to say it's probably one of the better capes in recent months that McFarlane was able to attach to a particular Batman. Jury's still a little bit out as far as the head sculpt specifically, because despite my slight commendation, so to speak, of them going with more or less a brand new sculpt in order to be able to capture that troika design with the protruding, very swollen up chin that he's got going on there, very specific to, again, that portrayal, and then of course the grimace, the eyes squinting there, and then most definitely the stylized cowl with the elongated ears. There's a couple of things here to note. One is that, of course, I have a little bit of a instinctive fear in me that I'm going to break these ears, despite still being rubberized here towards the ends to keep that to a minimum as far as breakage is concerned. But you'll notice that, unfortunately, due to the way that the overall assembly and stitching of the cape is, along with this very rigid plastic collar piece to keep everything in tow, that unfortunately came at the casualty of really good head articulation, because you'll notice, or rather hear, that it's very difficult to move in either direction. Rotating side to side, yes, we're in articulation already. Rotating it side to side, you can blatantly tell it's very, very difficult. He can kind of nudge it, but you can practically forget about 360 mobility whatsoever. Same thing goes for the tilting. It's all one piece, so there's no exact head joint. It's more so of a neck joint at the bottom of the neck and not much of anything else. So moving the head downward, basically moving the head in any kind of direction is going to move the neck and head combined Batman Return style, which is funny because, like I mentioned before, they were taking huge inspirations from that particular Burton design. And it looks like that they took that just a little bit too much to heart, because the head, at least in McFarlane fashion, because the head, as you can see, tilting it up and down, he can definitely tilt downwards pretty generously, but tilting up pretty much stops at the general level right about right there before you can see a little bit of the plastic kind of protruding from the joint here towards the bottom. And then tilting side to side, again, can kind of nudge ever so slightly, but at the behest of slight squeaking there to where it feels very rigid and very stiff. And even with the pass of the hair dryer, it wasn't necessarily able to help all that much. Moving the wires of the cape out of the way, the arms will then be able to rotate the 360, though a little bit stagnant there. Again, already passed it with the hair dryer, and we still have some really harsh squeaking happening there. Extension towards the sides is a bit more fluid and a little bit ratcheted in terms of kind of keeping the positions in varying degrees, but unfortunately not much in the way of butterfly or shrugging motion. There's like a slight little bit of movement found on the right one, if you can kind of tell a little bit from moving front and back and slightly side to side, but not much of anything else found on the left, which I believe is a symptom kind of passed down from one version of the Buck to the next. I remember distinctly that the Batman Spawn version also came with that problem. The biceps are also able to rotate the full 360 degrees, and you do have two joints at the elbows, though again, they're a little bit on the stiff side, and because of the way that everything's kind of assembled and tooled, they're a little too firm for my liking, to where it just kind of it just doesn't feel all that pleasant in hand. And then naturally, you're going to have ball joints that do allow the hands to be able to rotate in place 360 and bend inwards and outwards no problem. But then you get to the torso where things get just a little bit too robust. Like I mentioned before, the torso is able to rotate the full 360, but when it comes to any kind of crunching, you could practically forget about it when it comes to crunching forwards. Extension towards the sides, a bit more generous, but it does create a little bit of a gap right there. And side to side is a little too squicky. It only just nudges barely a couple of degrees. Same thing goes for the waist. You'll notice it doesn't really help all that much in the form of any kind of crunching on the obliques. Extension towards the sides, a bit more favorable, but again, not much found towards the front, and you can hear so much squeaking there that it's not even funny. But technically, you can rotate at the waist 360 degrees. Just mind the extra bit of force you're going to require because, like I said, it's just everything is just pressed together just so firmly that it's difficult to have a very silent playthrough with this figure as far as the posability is concerned. And to keep the squeaks happening, of course, the legs can move upwards about that far, not too bad, and then extension towards the back, not too bad. Again, creating a slight little bit of separation between the diaper piece and the top of the leg there. But likewise, you can also split on over to the sides. Ironically, one of the more quieter joints, because generally when I kind of split McFarlane figures, they have a tendency to have that little clickety-clack happening within the joint. But this time, it's a bit smoother than I was anticipating. Nevertheless, though, you do have two knee joints, either of which are a little bit difficult. I just gave the figure a bit of a pass with the hairdryer, and they're not making as much bumps as they were before, but once they kind of cool down, they have a tendency to stick a little bit. And then the ankle joints are, again, ball joints. They're not really utilizing that brand new flush joint that I like. So nevertheless, you are technically still able to pivot the ankle up and down a pretty good amount. And technically they can rotate. However, my beef with the ball joints is that when it comes to rotation, you kind of have to grab the entirety of the joint and rotate it as opposed to just grabbing it by the foot. Because when you do so, you're left with just some simple pivoting side to side at the base of the ankle. Like you can kind of see before you right there. So you have to kind of futz with it and grab it overall. And then here towards the front, you have some really good toe articulation that's able to bend at the full 90-degree angle. So you can see right here that there's a couple of joints here and there that don't feel all too bad. But at the same time, it's still reminding me an awful lot of antiquated approaches to the joints, because it is at the end of the day still utilizing a buck that, in my opinion, at the point that we're at with the progression that McFarlane has made, especially when it comes to felt good capes, especially with a really badass one such as this that again ended up surprising me incredibly well as far as the dynamic approach to the cape and the fact that I'm able to literally just pose it and not even think about it all too much and pose it in a way that looks legitimately badass in whatever kind of stance I have Troika Batman here in. The articulation kind of lets it down because even though you have the basic points, it's really how they feel in hand that makes the whole process somewhat unpleasant to me, because again, we're still throwing it back to a buck that's utilizing parts from 2021, early 2022. And as much as we have all of these stylized spikes to call it back to Batman Troika, having Batman doing all this cracking and squeaking and all these unpleasant sounds while trying to pose him, it's unnerving, especially when you take into consideration that someone out there were probably looking forward to a Troika interpretation, one of which may be considered a little on the obscure side. And here you have him fully realized by McFarlane, only to then realize that it's simply just taking a pre-existing buck that I think maybe at this point we need to start retiring and look forward to something that can maybe make a bit of a splash, or at least make go out with a bang. Again, to take into consideration where we're at right now in the timeline, which is the whole possibility that McFarlane could be losing the license in July of 2026. And so when you're dealing with a buck such as this, where you have the articulation being a little, for lack of a better term, as the kids like to say these days, kind of mid, it's a little disappointing considering that, again, you have visible seams right here, again, harkening back to those antiquated practices of 2021, 2022 bucks. And they tried to dress it up with like the all black that is sleek looking. And then, of course, drawing your attention would have to be the brand new head sculpt, the elongated ears. And then, of course, like I said, the underestimated nature that I was giving this cape that ended up surprising me. But then you toss in, again, the articulation that I was mentioning, or the fact that he comes with pretty standard accessories as far as a bonus pair of asymmetric hands, one of which is the left fist and then the other is the gripping hand, of which again would have liked it if maybe we could have either two fists, two gripping hands, but here we again bring in the asymmetric nature of this, that it not only reminded me that this is blatantly taking that pre-existing Batman buck, but then on top of that, bringing this frustration of having, wishing that we could have gotten a fisted right hand or a gripping left hand. But then you also have this very swollen up Batarang that is okay, pretty decently sculpted, but not much in the form of paint applications because, of course, it's matching that of this specific suit. So there's not much that I can really remark about that here, apart from the fact that if you were waiting for some sort of Troika representation on your list, this is most definitely going to be able to fulfill that. But for anyone that was hoping that they would probably take some chances with this guy, I think we're gonna have to let that ship sail, considering that maybe there's some bigger fish to fry within the remaining year of the DC license under the tenure of McFarlane, or maybe we should possibly be preparing for iterations such as this. Iterations that managed to garner a 6 out of 10. Which again bums me out because I've seen images from the Troika comic in passing and thinking that that's such a overly stylized and dynamic and fully realized Batman in a way that I'm thinking to myself, maybe we could have gotten those exaggerated proportions or something, much more unique and realized to the body proportions of the sculpting if maybe he was made into a resin statue as opposed to a DC Multiverse figure, because in the end, that's going to mean that we're going to end up with a pre-existing buck. And again, as the time winds down, it's time to then start preparing for, I don't know, maybe it's the cynic in me, but there's a part of me that's hoping that at least we can take a very unique incarnation of Batman and give it a full realization during this potential last year of the license. Because whether you like it or not, these incarnations is more or less kind of cementing this current chapter in the timeline as a bit of a make or break situation for certain collectors and within the McFarlane Toys community. But is that enough to sway you in any kind of direction? Were you looking forward to Batman Troika in any kind of representation, even if it means just taking a pre-existing mold and just giving it a whole dab of spikes, the nylon cape, which I still have to go on record, I thoroughly did enjoy with this figure. Pretty surprising. But then, of course, you got the elongated ears and then the articulation that, again, still feels kind of icky in hand to where probably could have utilized the Nightfall buck instead, but I know that in terms of proportions, especially considering that this is the Batman taking place after Nightfall, that probably wouldn't have. But then again, Nightfall buck is the Nightfall buck from the Nightfall storyline, so maybe that probably would have been the best direction. What do you guys think? Let me know down in the comment section your guys' feedback, and if you guys enjoyed this review, hit the thumbs up button down below. If you guys did not enjoy this review, hit the thumbs down nonetheless. And of course, as always, stay humble, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.